So they are non-specific catalysts. In other words, they screw up the specific catalysts that only do one job in a cell. And so the combination of the chemical heavy metal, the radiation, and the nanoparticle effect just is a death machine. And if you get exposed to depleted uranium, it is a death sentence. Every single soldier we're sending to Iraq and Afghanistan now, they're so contaminated. Those poor soldiers are mentally ill in 2 months because uranium targets the brain. One atom of uranium, one alpha particle, can cause cancer under the right conditions. One speck. I've got airflow charts that a former naval intelligence officer in England made for me. He's also a meteorologist, and he was a Middle East oil and gas consultant. His name is Peter Eyre. He has access to the pilot's database because he used to own his own airplane companies, and he had to work up the flight plans for the pilots. So he used that database to plot the winds and wind direction, and of course the wind blows in different directions depending on altitude. So our troposphere is what, from the ground up to about 60 or 70 miles above the ground, the surface of the Earth. That's called the troposphere. That's the most dynamic part of the atmosphere because it's where storms, hurricanes, winds, convection, very, very, very dynamic part of the atmosphere. And so the depleted uranium forms on the battlefield or wherever they're using it on the surface of the Earth, and it floats up into the wind currents, and it's carried all over in every single direction. It's not like the jet stream that's much higher and goes from west to east. This is a total global mixing in 1 year of every single battle and every single speck of uranium that is created in these countries where they've been using it. And it's over here in 7 to 9 days. It's in the Los Angeles drinking water. It's in the drinking water everywhere in America. It's in all the rivers and the lakes. And I can prove it from the United States Geological Survey report about a year and a half ago. The USGS tested male fish in lakes and rivers all over the U.S. and the ocean too, and they wanted to determine how much intersex was expressed in the male fish population, because uranium is an estrogen and a hormone disruptor. And intersex means that in a male fish, where there should be sperm-producing cells only for reproduction, that's the tissues, reproductive tissues, there should only be sperm-producing tissue. But in every population they tested in the United States, there were female eggs or ova in the same sperm-producing tissues in the male fish. That's called intersex, or in humans we call it hermaphrodite, and it is being reported all over the world that females and males are more widely reported hermaphrodites now because of these hormonal and estrogen effects, the alteration of normal reproductive tissues by the uranium effects. And an African runner, a female runner a year ago, was winning all her gold medals. She was on her way to the Olympics. She was a black woman from 18 years old from South Africa. And people said, we have to sex test her. We have to sex test her. Maybe she's a man, because she was so good at running. They did a urine test, and her testosterone levels were higher than normal, but they were not out of the range for a woman. So they did an internal examination of her reproductive organs. She had a vagina, but she had no uterus and she had no ovaries. She had testicles instead. And in an embryo developing inside the mother, in the uterus, there are two cells in the very early beginning stages after conception in this new organism, and those two cells either turn into ovaries in a female or they turn into testes if it's a male. So what we're doing is we're mixing up sexes in the same organisms. It's also reported in the Arctic and polar bear populations. The uranium goes up there too. They reported 17 female polar bears with male reproductive organs. They had penises, and yet they had uteruses, and they gave birth to baby polar bears, cubs. So we are actually sterilizing and mixing sexes in the whole global biosphere. The United Nations, who is carrying this out and covering it up, it's global depopulation. It's genocide of the whole planet. They're carrying it out and they're covering it up. They authorize these wars. They send their own UN peacekeepers. Afterwards, they get poisoned. The UN is fully aware of what's happening, and two of the UN undersecretaries, Hans von Spanek and Dennis Halliday, absolutely terrified of the information that I'm giving. A lot of it, I only use government information. It's all in their data. It's all in their graphs. It's all in their research papers. The whole truth is there. They just hide it by compartmentalizing. They are two of my biggest critics, and I had a death threat from the United Nations 2 years ago, and it was for an article that I wrote called Populations Exposed to Environmental Uranium, Increases in Infertility and Reproductive Cancers. It was published in a Namaste magazine in England, and after that came out, I received a death threat from Dr. Rosalie Bertell, who is an agent for the Vatican and the Pope, but she's also a secret agent for the United Nations. And I was rather surprised because I'd worked with her for years. So I wrote another one 6 months later called Global Implications of Sellafield, the Irish Seacoast Effect and Beyond. And what I proved is that the British have been dumping huge amounts of radiation into the Irish Sea, and it's carried in the big ocean current that controls climate on this planet, that goes down the Atlantic and in deep water, but it upwells in the Indian Ocean, and all those radioactive poisons from the Irish Sea have killed over 25 million Indian babies. We can tell by correlating the radioactive releases in England in the Irish Sea, because we know when they did the releases and how much. We can correlate that with spikes in infant mortality in India, and there's a 100% correlation. So after I wrote that, I was in my office working. About a week after that came out, and my face was slashed with a laser weapon, and Major Doug Rockey, who was in charge of the depleted uranium cleanup after the first Gulf War, told me that Colonel Melman in the depleted uranium office in the Pentagon was responsible for slashing my face. So I have a deformed chin now. It cut all the way to the bone. It was a U-shaped cut slash, and it was done through the window of my office, and it required 5 stitches. I went to the hospital. There was a veteran working as a male nurse or something in the area where I was held, and I'm sure that he was an agent for the Army. And the doctor who came to stitch up my face, they all told me that I needed 5 stitches. She put 3 in and left the sides open so that the muscles would not grow back together properly. So my daughter was kidnapped when she was 13 by the nuclear weapons program, and I have seen her maybe twice in 13 years.